Hey people, let's try to get into groups. Today's session will be a little bit of slides, but a lot of common discussions. So having your table sort of form a subgroup would be fantastic. Thanks. All right, welcome everybody back. I'm seeing great returned faces here. Aside from welcoming you for the next 15 to 20 minutes, we are going to have a lot of sort of joint breakout sessions today. So if you're comfortable with the sort of table that you've selected as your group for discussion, that's great. If not, go ahead and find a table that would enable you to have that conversation. So, a little bit of housekeeping for today. Presentations, again, are going to be recorded and hosted online with registration. For questions and answers, if you're remotely joining us, you can add questions to chat. We will try to address them as best we can within the time constraints that we have. In the room, we will have a mic passed around. And breakout sessions will be shared out via mic in the room and remotely online. I realized that not many people actually looked at the guide yesterday, so we have an online OTP 23 guide, which allows you to kind of see where we are in terms of the sessions and follow the progression, be able to anticipate what might happen next. It also has all the links to the Zoom, to the captioner feed, as well as the Jamboard that we will use today. If you're looking for the Open Sidewalks Mapathon, you're not in the right room. Let me make sure, first of all, let's see, if you want to head down to G04, that's where they are in person. Is there anybody here who wants to know where that is? Is there anyone online who's interested in joining that session remotely? Because that's a different session as well.
Where's the location on that?
So if you take the elevator down to floor G, which is ground level, there's a room named G04, that's the number, and the name of it is Bezos. It's essentially heading eastward at the edge of that. I'm so sorry, I couldn't hear you. Say that again.
I was just going to say you.
Okay. Okay. So now, if you're interested in signing up for, again, our alpha or the advisory committees, please go ahead and sign up at tinyurl.com, TDI Alpha 2023. And again, if posting to social media, please use OpenThePaths or Move Equity. So my first question is, why are we still here today? So in case you were wondering why you got up on a Saturday and showed up, I just wanted us to sort of reclaim our space because we left on such a good vibe last night, but I would love to pick up where we left off. So we're trying to bring community and practitioners working in the area of access to transportation, and specifically looking at challenges of how data can really contribute to ameliorating challenges to mobility equity. And we're trying to identify challenges and open problems to production and consumption of multimodal accessibility first data. And we'd love to help practitioners find community and establish common practices. So today we're a much smaller group. I would love to open it up for anybody who wants to identify themselves and say who they are and why they're in the room if you are interested. So we have mics.
Well, I guess I'll be giving a talk. Turn around here. I wanted to discuss ADA, how you would prepare a transition plan and a self-evaluation plan. I wanted to share some wayfinding, and Denise was going to share our PROW work, how we do a GIS, and how we prioritize, and how we get results. And I'll be really honest with you, yesterday when I heard about all those old surveys, I mean, the goal of doing a survey is to make it a living document and update it. So we do hope we've given a methodology to keep those surveying tools alive. I do love wayfinding. That's my passion. I'm writing a book on it. It seems to take longer and longer. But wayfinding for all, for physical limitations as well as cognitive. So I look forward to sharing that as well.
Should we do like one on that, like while you're passing it, we can start the next one? Is that all right?
So, my name's Doreen Cornwell, and one of my hats is a Washington Council of the Blind Advocacy Committee. And I love knowing who you are and what your organization is. And if you want to say whether you identify as having a disability, that is also helpful. But I know that that's like sometimes people are careful about that. Anyway, this is my badly behaved white cane, Thwack. He has his own Twitter account too. But so why am I here? I didn't actually read the schedule. I love the idea of collaboration. I kind of do make your own job projects of different scale, but sometimes just being in the room with the right person is helpful. And so like if somebody's working on, I don't know if there's other people who are working on their ADA transition plans, or like what's a theme that might come up from other people introducing themselves. Do you want to?
Hi, my name is Amara Skirmerhorn. I'm a student at Seattle Central College in the graphic design program. I'm also the executive of communication for the student council. And I'm a low vision pedestrian myself, so I think One Bus Away is like the best app ever. And I'm really curious about multimodal accessibility, especially, finding ways for people to make the best out of the information at hand and finding ways to get places if one option fails or isn't available.
Plan B.
So thanks for having me.
Plan B.
Hi, I'm Laura, and I am the program manager for Find a Ride, a one-call, one-click website and system with HopeLink. And I myself have multiple marginalized identities, including disabilities, long-term and acute. And I am just excited to be here and learn. I'm 2 months into the job, and I didn't know what GTFS was 2 months ago, and now I'm an expert in it.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Ricky Jam. I'm a PhD student in electrical and computer engineering. I work with Dr. Anat Taspi at the Tasker Center, and my research is on using scalable machine learning approaches to collecting and analyze the pedestrian data. And I'm here today to learn about how that data can better serve the community and what can we get back from the community.
Hi, my name is Kevin Chambers. I have a consulting company called OpenThePaths Transit Technology, and my work is assisting small transit agencies in being effective using technologies. So small agencies touches rural, small urban, and a lot of specialized within urban areas. And so that covers a lot of ground in terms of what technology is, but a lot of it is helping agencies manage the physical technology, but also understand what outcomes they want. And of course, data is right in there in the middle of that. So, and data standards and helping agencies be strategic and make sure their investments they make are ones that will really drive the results they want. So I'm excited to be here.
Hi, my name is Kristen, and I work on the TDI project here at UW. I am a data geek at heart, and I'm here today. I'm really interested in hearing other folks' perspectives on the data and how we can make the data best useful to everyone, and also amenable to being produced by the data producers.
I'm Elizabeth Saul. I introduced myself yesterday, so I won't go into detail. But so I'm a sole proprietor, Seattleite usually. My company's Urban Labs. But in addition to what I talked about yesterday with the California Integrated Travel Project, I also am working on creating a combined data set on which to derive wayfinding maps for the Bay Area transit agencies. So that's also really relevant here.
I'm Steve. I have a disability. I have a mobility disability, so my view of Seattle is very colored by how it's possible to get around. I've been involved in several mapping projects, particularly of downtown Seattle and routes that somebody who can't get up the hills is capable of using.
Hi everyone, my name is Vanessa Bohm. I'm the imposter in the room. I am a data scientist. I'm currently working in logistics, but I'm looking to go more into transportation policy. I myself, I don't have a car, so I get around completely with other modes of transport. One of the things that motivates me to be here today is that my husband works on ADA cases, and I see him putting in painstakingly data about broken sidewalks and barriers and so on, and I think there's just a lot of opportunity here at the intersection of data science with these mapping projects to facilitate this kind of work.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Cyrus Comento. I'm a research fellow at the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. The Bureau of Transportation Statistics is interested in ultimately putting out data products for like pedestrian and accessibility infrastructure, and so I'm here to learn more in depth about some of these standards and schemas, and also just build relationships with everybody here.
Good morning, everyone. I'm John Campbell with Arcadis IBI Group. I work on Open Trip Planner. And I think why I'm here today is I want to kind of step outside of that Open Trip Planner context and learn more about how other folks are using the data.
I'm Thomas Craig. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a data analyst at the Washington State Department of Transportation, and I'm involved in helping to measure access in the state of Washington. Particularly interested in sidewalk and walkway data for that access analysis. I don't identify as having a disability. I don't own a car. I still use my partner's car to go to Costco once every 3 months. And I think sidewalks and walkways, I think there's an opportunity for communities to assert their rights and to mobility, to be in community through understanding and advocating for the presence of community-oriented spaces, and that sidewalk data is a big part of that.
Good morning. My name is Carol, and I work for the City of Seattle, primarily with the taxi cab and for-hire transportation industries. I program manage the Wheelchair Accessible Services Fund, which provides reimbursements for the higher operational costs associated with operating wheelchair accessible vehicles. A question that we are trying to answer is how can we more effectively dispatch rides to passengers across different taxi associations. And we're looking for software systems that could potentially address that problem. So I'm here with a disciplinary background in social work, trying to stretch a little bit, learn more about data and transportation planning, and gain from the wisdom of the group. I do identify as a person with a wheelchair, or a disability using a wheelchair, and I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mark Hollenbeck. I'm the director of the Washington State Transportation Center, which is a research group here on the University of Washington campus. I'm a transportation data geek, as many of you are. Mostly what I'm interested in is how you collect data and use it to make decisions or support transportation agencies as they make decisions. I'm here to learn. I know transportation data, I know agencies. I need to know more about how the world needs to use the data and what data needs to be out there, and therefore that guides what you can collect and how you can collect it and how you use it. So I'm here to listen and from the knowledge of what people really need in the world.
Eric Peterson with the MV Pathways and Common Paths Project and Transportation Geek, and here to listen and learn from the leading experts in the room. So pleasure to be here. Cheers.
Hi, good morning, y'all. Taylor Reich, they, them pronouns. I'm with ITDP, the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, a global NGO supporting sustainable and inclusive urban transport, especially in low and middle income countries. And so I'm very interested in learning about how to measure accessible transportation and what can be done using these data standards or these techniques outside of the United States.
All right. Oh, sorry, Alex, yes. One more in the room, and then we're going to skip over to you guys in Zoom land.
Hello, everyone. I am Alex, and I am a urban planning master's student at UW, and I'm a research assistant with the Not Caspi and Mark. And I've probably been emailing back and forth with a lot of you because I've been helping set up this event. But yeah, that's me.
Okay, and for you online, I'm just going to go down the list, if that's all right, and you can choose not to use the mic, but the question that was being asked is if you would like to identify yourself, if there's an organization that you identify as representing, and what you're hoping to learn. I will start with Anna Zivarts.
This is Anna. Hi, everyone. Let's see. Let me turn on my camera real quick. I work for Disability Rights Washington, Disability Mobility Initiative, and I was hoping to join you all in person today, but I have a sick kid, so maybe later if things improve. And I identify as disabled. I'm low vision, and yeah, excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you. Kim Voros. I will move on to Elle Wexler. All good. Okay. Well, so and finally, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Anat Caspi. I'm the director of the Tasker Center for Accessible Technology and the PI for the TDI that we've been mentioning a lot. I, too, am hoping to learn a lot from you and really find this community and make sure that it sustains. I think for a lot of us, at least from what we've heard from a lot of planners in our studies, there's a sense of isolation where you're working in an institution or agency that may not fully recognize the value in the data collection that we're talking about. And so hoping to find community here in the sense that we find common ground and shared interests as well as practices that could really elevate all of our work. So I'm going to ask if there are any loose ends to tie up from yesterday. And I actually asked Polly Okuniev to rejoin us today, but she was unable to. I know a lot of you mentioned you had questions to ask her. Unfortunately, we ran out of time yesterday, but we may have had some time today. She said she's glad to accept any questions and she'll respond to them online. But are there any other sort of loose ends that people wanted to mention that they felt maybe we didn't complete the discussion, there were still open-ended questions? Anyone? Okay, well, so then we have some time, and what I wanted to do today, after having reviewed, the 4 different sessions that we went through yesterday, sort of first looked at what are potential producers doing out there in order to get interoperable data to work together to create some kind of mass deployment, or the deployment that ties different types of demand response transit together that Matthew Widener was discussing. So we saw some of the challenges in that. We also discussed what are challenges to data producers, what are the institutional hurdles, the cultural hurdles, as well as just the data collection hurdles that they're facing. We then heard from a multitude of different data specification and standardization efforts that are attempting to do this at different ways with different partners and different types of collaborations. And then finally, we talked to different data aggregators and trying to understand the perspective there of what are best practices for data aggregation. And I think that it's really important to take a step back and say, well, we all sort of understand that this type of data could really help us both in terms of assessment, evaluation of where we are with respect to transportation equity and transportation access, but it could also drive a lot of new services because we are able to learn, what the transportation network actually does provide. And so I do find that when we go out there and talk to our community, there are diverging both interests and views on what those terms, mobility, equity, or access to transportation, actually mean. And I was hoping to kind of gather our brains together to come to some agreement, or maybe not, but at least be able to talk about it in coherent terms of what are the differences in terms of how we look at equity and access? Because many of us are beholden to some kind of institutional edict, right? Even the US DOT currently highlights equity and access as one of the 5 main principles that the US DOT is promoting. But I find that practitioners have a really hard time interpreting that in absence of really clear, coherent evaluation metrics and performance measurements that allow us to say, oh yeah, that's inequitable and that is equitable. So that's what I'm trying to get the conversation around today. So our process, and it's a little bit ad hoc-ish, what would we mean by transportation equity if we were all to agree on a common terminology? And what would we mean by equity and access to transportation? And we have a Jamboard online if any of you want to join it, but I'll take notes as we go. And I trust Laura will too, because she's been doing such an awesome job. And then I'd like to identify some common themes and ideas and identify any places where we might disagree on what those metrics might look like. And so ensuring that our definition is smart in the sense that it has specificity, it's measurable, it's achievable, has relevance to all of our work. And we know here that there's so many different use cases to this data that are represented in this room and in the Zoom room. And finally is time bound. And so during the discussion, please use the chat for short responses, and we can use the Jamboard throughout. But if the Jamboard is inaccessible to you, we will be taking notes and using the board. So anybody doesn't have the link to the Jamboard? Okay. It is tinyurl.com/OTP, as in OpenThePaths 23, the year, and just jam, and it's all one word. And I just typed it in the chat in the Zoom as well for anybody who wants to join there. Okay, great. So I pulled some definitions, but before we go there, I think we all agree, but I wanted to just, demonstrate that this is still a thing, that multimodal and layered transportation is where we are in terms of the system. But the impacts of having the system multimodal and layered means that it is rarely distributed uniformly. And there are obviously studies to support that. But does that necessarily mean that it is not equitable? Because lack of uniform distribution is not necessarily the metric by which we want to evaluate equity in transportation. So different types of common ways to evaluate equity or access in transportation that I just pulled from the literature are, one is distance to goods or services. Some can be as the crow flies types of analyses. Others can be road-bound connections. Geographic connectivity, so then you're actually using the infrastructure on the ground to assess connectivity. Transit service coverage, so Anna and colleagues looked at transit services and how coverage compares across the state of Washington. Comparative access to transportation across different demographic groups, so using some equity indices to understand who has access to which service, to which types of transportation. Then different usage rates for services, so it's not about access, but rather how are people actually using these. And then finally, assessing walkability and bikeability. And now I want to open it up for others to suggest other types of equity and access metrics that are used out there. Maybe I didn't cover everything. No. Yes, please. Cost. So affordability for different populations, or?
Affordability for the mode of transportation, such as taxi fare versus bus fare versus ferry fare versus gas per gallon, all those costs.
Okay. I put that on the Jamboard. Yes.
Non-monetary cost is also like time cost.
Mm-hmm. So do you mean that the time to get places, like getting to your workplace, getting to your grocery store, or?
In general, yeah. But, yeah. You also mentioned yesterday the time to research and understand how to get through.
Could people either use the mic or
sorry.
have you
Yes.
repeat what's being said?
Fair enough. So Carol mentioned the cost of services, so costs of different modes of transportation. And Thomas mentioned Sai mentioned the time costs associated with both getting to specific places as well as the time cost for discoverability of services.
Yeah. Thank you for the mic. This is Doreen again, and I like the conversation about time. I know that there's this urban planning concept about the 15-minute city, and if you live in a place like the Puget Sound where traffic congestion is horrible, and sometimes there's just a time tax on what you're trying to do. So thinking about that, that like cost of congestion is part of the equity picture, if you know, about where you can afford to live and how much you have to travel. Karen Breitmeyer yesterday was talking about how to help people live their best lives, and that is such a cool concept. I have no idea how to measure it, but it is also honest about not everybody's going to want to leave the house and go take a 3-hour trip every day. You know, I know people for whom it's a really big deal to be able to go to a club and get in the door and not have to wait downstairs in the first floor because there's no elevator. And they don't try to do that every day, but it's really important when they do that, or, you know, when they're able to do that. And I don't think there's any data source that is easy to measure that, but keeping in mind how people meet their needs, and are they able to feel like their needs are met, and that they're doing it in a way that their bodies and spirits can handle.
I like it, but it's hard for me to satisfy the smart, right? So any suggestions out there? Oh, yes.
I would try to follow up on that idea as, thank you, Thomas, in follow up to that idea to try to capture it in a smart way. One aspect of it could be like exposure to harm or potential exposure to harm. Like, for instance, coming out of COVID, the amount of effort that people had to take in order to stay safe from exposure. There's also harm related to discriminatory practices, such as a wheelchair user using public transit, people who don't want to get out of the way to allow the wheelchair passenger to board, or being forced to wait until the last person who is ambulatory boards first, and then that creates conditions of making it harder to access the in-ride services. Mm-hmm. So I know that's still a bit squishy in terms of measurability.
But it's a thing.
But I think there's a big time factor that gets amplified with that, because you're trying to board and it's taking a long time because the driver is unfamiliar with your mobility device and where the securement attachments have to go, and then you become the center of attention for everybody on that vehicle. So hopefully that helps to operationalize some of the ideas that we're talking about.
Thank you.
I wanted to bring up daytime dependence of all of these things, like transit service can change very dramatically from different times of the day or different times of the week. And also getting around on sidewalks can be very daytime dependent. If there's no lighting, it might be dangerous at night. So those equity aspects really depend on, is also, it means that some people cannot get around as flexibly time-wise as others.
There's a little notch that you have to flip up.
So this ties into geographic connectivity and time. And just to give a specific example, I live on West Hill, Kent, where, you know, a 15-minute walk, you know, it might be walkable, but the incline is very steep and has a rugged terrain. And, you know, depending on your own ability, that incline can either be 10 minutes or 20 minutes. It varies a lot. So I think, you know, geographic connectivity, accessibility, and time they all factor into each other as well. And I think, maybe one thing I can point to where maybe like this changed a bit is, with COVID, a lot of the bus lines got cut in the Kent area. And there's some transportation hubs. There's Kent Station, and for me, the closest is the I-5 ramp. So I think, another specific example would be like the highway ramp transit center, so like the park and rides. I think that connectivity to those areas could be one focus.
One type of equity that I didn't really think about, despite having been told to figure out how WashDOT should apply certain state laws, until Front and Centered wrote a great report about HEAL Act and Climate Commitment Act that was really educational, and they pointed out basically budget decision making, who has control over where the money gets directed, I think is a type of equity.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
That's good. I was trying to wait patiently. It's unusual for me to be patient, but I'll try. I want to rephrase something a little bit, just as I think, then please don't ask me how to measure it, because that's the problem. I think we talk about modes, access to modes, and in many respects, I think that's the wrong framework for everybody. I think the real term we should have is access to opportunity, because depending on who you are, some modes are irrelevant to you and other modes are. And where you live, some modes are irrational and other modes are perfectly rational. So if I live in a rural area, to say I should be able to get somewhere on transit, it's financially irrational. It might be an absolute necessary thing. So the access side is, does it exist? Can I afford it? So there's an affordability aspect of it, and can I get at a rational time to the places that I would like to go, which kind of goes to what we heard. Can I go to the club? Yeah, it's only once every 2 months, but are there clubs I can actually get to? Can I get there rationally? Depending on who I am, it may mean transit, it may mean a taxi, it may mean walking, it may mean whatever. And you want to be a little transportation agnostic. You want the transportation to fit the human on how they get there, but they need to have access to food, healthcare, work. They need opportunity. So to me, the equity framework is access to opportunity, fair access to opportunity, where that's time, frequency, and cost. And what matters to cost? I may have a disability, but I'm, Bill Gates when he's 90, right? Money will not be the issue, but that doesn't mean he still doesn't need wheelchair access in this imagined state, right? So there are, does Bill have access, as opposed to someone who is poor, lives, has no money, can't afford an Uber ride or whatever, which might be available. And the real question is, can we find a way to give them access to the existing services at a price they can afford within their limited means? So that's a complex way of, or it's a complex system, but trying to shrink it to a simple phrase, access to opportunity, I think is a good way to phrase all of these things that fit in, but the change in terms of fairness on what your condition is and where you live and what is financially rational to whoever has to supply those services.
Hey, I just want to call out, there's a couple comments on chat.
Oh, please.
So, and I don't know if Anna has a nice comment, and Kim also. Should we let them unmute and make their, okay.
If they'd like, yes.
So, Anna, Kim, if you can hear me, if you'd like to unmute, otherwise I'll read your comments out.
This is Anna. I can share that one measure that I thought works, is super intriguing, is the Transportation Security Index. Questions would start to get at the emotional burden. And I think this is some of the things that Doreen and others were talking about, but like how within the last 30 days, did you feel like you were left out, or did you feel excluded from social things, or did you feel bad asking for rides? Some of the things that aren't quite as hard, I don't know. I mean, I think they're equally as important as some of the other, is this thing actually physically accessible? But, do you feel like you have, is getting there going to cost you so much sort of emotional labor that it's no longer worth it, or stress? Yeah, so I pasted a link there in the chat, and I can copy it over to the other board thing if that's helpful.
Thank you. Carol, do you feel like that addresses the social barriers that you brought up earlier? Yes, cool. Thanks, Anna. Looks like Kevin has, were there other comments in chat? Sorry, I just can't see chat.
Yeah, this is.
Go ahead, Kim.
Go ahead.
This is Kim, and I just wanted to second what Anna said about the Transportation Insecurity Index. There is a great Talking Headways podcast where they speak with the creators, and I actually had a chance to speak with them for some NCHRP research we're doing. And their whole idea is they're asking questions that measure the outcomes rather than asking the details, because asking about modes gets too deep and is incomprehensible. They're trying to get the TSI down to a representative survey of 4 questions. So it could be picked up by someone like the US Census. Right now it's, I believe, 15 questions. And they're actively looking for agencies and opportunities to test right now.
Thank you.
Okay.
Is that it?
Sure.
Sorry, Kristen, were those the 2 in chat? Or cool. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to grasp at something. So I'm wondering if one thing that occurs to me in terms of access to opportunity, like all the different modes or things that we rely on to that with each of those items that we use, they fall on a continuum between something that is sort of infrastructural and can be sort of assumed upon, and at the other end, things that are ad hoc and have to be actively done to avail. So like, and I'm going to, at one end, extreme is maybe a sidewalk. Like it would have to be actively blocked for you to not have it. And at the other extreme, and that perhaps could be tied to greater equity if you have access to a sidewalk. And at the other end is something that takes positive action, and especially if it takes positive human action, actually staffing. Like, oh, I need to call the ADA paratransit, someone has to answer, then it has to go through a whole Rube Goldberg machine before it actually results in you having access to something. And then, like you can look at everything and put it somewhere on that continuum, and maybe it's even, microtransit has fewer human interaction points because you're using an app and doesn't have to, you get sort of positive reflections. Oh, yes, it's going to come in, but it's still a human driver, so on. So I don't know what to call that, but it seems like something that you could tie back to equity.
So I'll ask you, I put 4 different things up and haven't put them in categories, but it sounds like it's split between institutional supports and infrastructural supports, and then the supports might be human or machines on the institutional side, or it might be physical or digital on the infrastructure side. Is that fair or not so fair?
Yeah, and maybe I'm trying to oversimplify this, but I'm almost like, what's the actual caloric energy required for a particular trip to happen? Mm-hmm. It's like for a sidewalk, it was created a while ago, right? For the specific trip, the amount of energy required on the part of the network is 0. Whereas, for an ADA paratransit, it's, quite a bit. So I don't know. Like I say, I'm grasping, and I don't know how useful it is in this context, but it seems like the low energy supports are more equitable and scalable versus the high caloric ones.
I'm not sure I am on the same wavelengths, but in AccessMap, we try to understand what level of effort does this particular mobility profile incur along this path, right? Like they told us their maximum uphill incline is 7%, and we're getting really close at 5.8. So for that person, the effort, is that what you call caloric? Might be higher than
more of like not effort on the part of the person moving, but on the infrastructure around it, which then leads back to like the reliability of that of those supports. Right, so like some, and with ADA paratransit, it's contingent on funding, it's contingent on weather, it's contingent on, not, 3 drivers not calling in sick on that day. You know what I mean? It's like there's a whole bunch of contingencies that are kind of loosely associated with that higher, sort of human level of input needed.
Or machines.
Or machines, exactly, exactly, yeah,
right.
yeah, exactly. AWS hasn't gone down, whatever, so.
So you would count up all of this caloric input into the system as a metric? This like level of effort to support the
I say this with great apology, but somehow, yes, maybe.
Okay. No. All right. So, the viewpoint that we've taken thus far has very much been the sort of social model of disability, where it is the system or infrastructure that is presenting the barriers. So it is in many ways, sort of, it's not just the infrastructure, it's the institutional infrastructure that you're saying is creating these potential burdens. I'm trying to understand how it would be related back to like the risk of failure, right? Like, because that's essentially, I think, what you're getting to, which is if there's so many friction points to maintaining this elevator in this one station, then it's a much higher risk of failing versus something that's already there in place. And
if they had built a ramp that could have replaced that elevator, for example, if that was possible, right? Something like that. Taken more, and I guess I say this from a particular vantage point that I have, which is working at small transit agencies and seeing how much they struggle with providing service and growing, and how many failure points exist, like how much they struggle. And so if, and this is sort of some of the stuff around, the idea of urbanism and the 15-minute city and all that, where it's like you have a built environment that requires less of those sort of manual inputs.
So taking us back to mapping, like, would you be able to map that?
I mean, you could almost be like, okay, if this is a trip that now requires ADA paratransit, right? Like, what kind of multiplier can you assign to that, right? And of course, this is squishy, right? Like, you can't be very precise, but you could, I could see how you could have put some kind of multiplier on that and apply that at a policy level of like, this is the amount of simplicity we get out of building this many more sidewalks, or allocating this more square footage to build in a ramp versus having an elevator, whatever. Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that often gets lost in a lot of these things is the cost of maintenance.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
And supports and
exactly
training.
Exactly. Yeah.
For sure. Oh, yeah. Somewhere there's a...
You touched on this exposure harm.
There we go. I know we mentioned this, exposure to harm, but I really would like to explore that in more depth because, you know, with COVID and then with homeless and lack of maintenance, this is just a huge percentage, you know, in the Bay Area. As I mentioned yesterday, just the cars are enormous. So I think a whole avenue there needs to be looked at and provided and really talk to many of the transportation departments. You've got to put a lot more effort into this.
So I'll respond to that now. We were actually asked by EPA to help them look at environmental exposure to toxicity and different, because they have metrics for pollution, but they don't necessarily know, you know, are the sidewalks adjacent to these pollutants? Are they nearby these toxic sources? So some people are thinking about it in that way, but it sounds like you're looking at other harms as well. And so
Oh yeah, I mean, a lot of people said, I'm not going to San Francisco because of the homeless. And true, as you go on to BART, you've got to move over several individuals. I mean, and they've tried with gates and doors, and I think I would really like to see more attention to creating a safer environment for travel.
I'm struggling tying safety with the harms and then the people in the way, but that's okay.
Well, I know when I was working with BART, that was a big issue. You know, is how to create a safer BART, you know, and we talked a lot about different ways of creating safe traffic, not only with the elevators, which are treacherous, but with entering the site and entering the actual BART train. And I think I would love to see priorities on that because the BART usage in San Francisco has dropped severely. I mean, just severely. And it's not people coming and going. I just think it's fear. And how do we overcome that? Just putting it out there.
Laura?
I think I want to provide a different perspective on this. I've heard this a couple of times now, but I'm quite close with a number of folks that are experiencing extreme housing instability, are very reliant on transit and are employed, and are using transit while they're sleeping in their tent or couch surfing or living in a tiny house village. They are very dependent on our transit systems, and they are transit riders and transit customers. And they themselves are more likely to be victims of crime because of their status of housing instability. And so when a transit agency takes kind of an othering mindset to a group of people, whether it's someone with disabilities or someone who has an unhoused status, and doesn't see them as customers too, I just want to be really careful, like how we're thinking about folks that haven't been given anywhere else to go. I know when I lived in Chicago, I felt like the transit agency took a really different approach than I've seen in some West Coast cities around this issue in terms of cooling buses in the summer and warming buses in the winter, and really took like an active approach to having the transit system be like a refuge for people that had been kind of abandoned by our society or you know, swept from one place to the other without, you know, any place for them to live. So I just wanted to present kind of that a different way to look at it, especially from my own experience over the last 4 or 5 years, becoming closer and closer in community with folks, and you know, just like everything, there's not a monolith. And there was one block where I was doing mutual aid where I'd say at least 40% of the people out of 40 people were employed, and when the sweep happened, they were offered a tiny house village all the way deep in South Seattle, but they were working in Ballard and living in Ballard. They lived in the same place for 3 years and had stability in that tent for 3 years, were employed about 30 hours a week. And because of being, you know, kind of displaced by the city to the tiny house village in South Seattle, now had to make some really difficult decisions in terms of taking 3 or 4 buses to get to that job. So just to think of those folks as transit users that are customers as well.
So in a way, I mean, you're expanding the definition of equity to relate to proximity to your goods and services and workplace and opportunities, economic opportunities, schooling opportunities, health opportunities. So does that fit the model that Mark suggested with access to those, or do we need to add an additional access to opportunity, or does it require more than that? Yeah.
I'd like to add something to Mark's definition based on that. Like, I think that there's the example of like having access to your community, not just your opportunity. I think that too often a lot of the mobility equity metrics that we look at is access to jobs and ladders of opportunity grants, and all the discretionary grant programs look at like how are you improving access to jobs, and it's not just jobs. It's being able to see your friends, being able to see your support network, being able to go to the park, being able to experience beauty, being able to go to Discovery Park and see the ocean makes me happy. And it's hard to take transit there, although it does exist. And so I think that I would like to be really careful in how we define opportunity. It's opportunity to, I would encourage us to think of that really broadly. And then I also think it's like combining that with reliability too. So, yeah.
Reliability. And does that question of institutional supports and infrastructure supports also get subsumed by reliability?
So I think the access to opportunity is an interesting lens. I've been sitting here thinking, like, how do we maximize the good stuff and minimize the bad stuff? And you can do that at an individual level, or you can do that at a neighborhood, or, you know, if your job is WSDOT and you're trying to pull together meaningful metrics with data streams that are of highly variable quality in a policy environment that's subject to change every time there's a legislative session at worst. I'm just sort of throwing that out there as a framework, but sometimes the question is also, is it necessary to go anywhere? For a while, one of the people on my committee lived 2 miles down a road to get to a bus, and he had to walk on the shoulder. I'm like, I am not asking you to come to meetings. How about conference calls? Do they work for you? But the other piece of access to opportunity is, one time I was working with a grant writer about a project for a computer lab aimed at people with disabilities. And she's like, don't talk about the disability stuff because the grant reviewers aren't going to understand that. So now I'm a grant reviewer for that program. And so every single time I review a grant, I say, tell me something about how you serve people with disabilities, something specific. I want to hear it. I don't care what it is. Is it in there, yes or no? That's my first criteria. But I think the other piece that's on my mind at the moment is my own neighborhood. There's a Sound Transit station going in, and so there's a lot of housing development, and there's a lot of construction. And after the construction gets all done, there will be lots of cool sidewalks, but right now there's lots of crappy sidewalks and construction mess. And last night when I got off the bus and went to the Amazon Fresh store, and my choices were walk home the rest of the way or wait for the bus that takes me, I waited for the bus because I'm like, I don't want to figure out what the sidewalk mess is. So I think there's a piece in here of how do things change over time, or because I think at this point, we're all kind of acutely aware that we're going to need to get into the face of Seattle DOT about sidewalks and the whole walk shed around the station. And it actually is even worse because Rainier Avenue is this big river of cars, and if you want to cross the river, the options as far as accessible pedestrian signals are kind of limited. I don't think these are like anecdotes, and it's definitely not getting us to the kind of smart measures Anna's talking about, but it is part of, okay, how much time do I have to spend in meetings with SDOT? Maybe I want to be doing something else. So there's different ways to come at the opportunity and the how much effort you have to expend to, maybe make it livable or to trade off about what else you do. Anyway, that's plenty. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Now I would like to give someone the mic.
Thank you.
I know the conversation kind of switched to like accessibility, not accessibility, but access to modes versus access to opportunity. But I think that, access to modes is opportunity as well. I think they are all connected. But the access to modes is especially important, for the modular transportation. But there was a point brought up about like the bathrooms at like transportation centers, and I think that's a valid point just because a lot of transit hubs don't have restrooms or close access to restrooms. So I think one thing that we should maybe consider is just, the access to accommodations at these centers, because if a commute is 2 hours, that's comparable to a flight. So having the opportunity to use the bathroom during your commute is crucial. Because with, whoever rides the bus, there's a very broad range. Having access to a bathroom would allow people the opportunity for a little bit of privacy or even just to freshen up a bit. I think anybody could appreciate that. I'm having so many thoughts now because there's been so many points that my mind is going. But yeah, relating just to like the toxic exposure on your route, I think human waste in an elevator. It makes sense if there's no access to bathrooms, but it's still not good to be around. And then I guess walking around in highly polluted areas, like areas with a lot of construction, it's at least safer if you have like a smooth surface to walk on and not have to worry about debris, or maybe if there's not enough wayfinding that tells you when you're about to walk on a highway shoulder. So I guess this all just ties to maybe the way that commuters are informed about certain things. I guess as a graphic designer, I'm thinking of wayfinding signs, and one more point talking about the micro-mobility that was brought up a while ago. Sorry for going way back, but I do really appreciate micro-mobility for getting to transportation hubs. I definitely will take a lift to the Sound Transit Angle Lake station, which is just, $15 versus a half-hour walk to the nearest bus stop that would take me to the light rail station is worth it in my eyes. So the only barrier that holds some people back from like Orca's current micromobility options is just accessing it through the app is the cognitive load, I guess, is a little much. Because the bus, it just comes, even, like the access bus on a, less trips, but Yeah, maybe I think, micromobility and just like how people are learning about it, I think is important. Maybe that's a UX problem, but it can be solved.
So I summarize that as access to information where the cognitive load is really imbalanced when it's hard for people to access the information, whether because the information is not there or it's not accessible to them in the form they need it, or it is unavailable for discovery. Is that a fair summary in that sense? Okay. Okay.
That's very good. Something that has come to mind from a few of the different points that have been made is on the transportation equity side rather than the access to transportation side. And that's the cost of influencing the transportation system. So when I worked in advocacy, a point that was made a lot is like, you have to fight tooth and nail with someone, sorry, Thomas, at a state DOT to get a sidewalk put in or a bike lane put in or a signalized crossing. And they're often, you'll be rebuffed with various regulations. Sometimes people will tell you, there haven't been enough injuries or fatalities at an intersection to put in the infrastructure that you're looking for. And so, yeah, I mean, that is like, that's a big cost to get something. And yeah, so that's just something that's been going through my mind. Other folks have been talking.
Very related. Another DOT that will remain nameless, but maybe let's call it the Southern Washington DOT. I complained at a town hall meeting about this project right down the street from my house, where there wasn't, there's no sidewalk from my house to the bus stop was one issue, and then they weren't going to put a crosswalk in, and they told me, well, we did a pedestrian count at that intersection, and there wasn't enough pedestrians to justify a crosswalk. And I just like, oh my goodness. So, that, but also I want to, just a thought on Doreen, your comments earlier, I think were really valuable. And one thing that made me think about is who pays the price of disruption? How does that disruption get allocated? Are we going to, if we close down that sidewalk, are we just like, making a little bit of the shoulder with no temporary curb cut that forces pedestrians to sort of like wiggle through an uncertain scenario? Or do we shut down the entire street and turn the entire street into a sidewalk and allow people who are using that sidewalk free access and put the cost of that disruption on drivers? Who's paying for the disruption?
Mm-hmm. Hi, I have the microphone over here. I have a follow-up question regarding ridership. So I know many transportation entities are very interested in their ridership numbers and specifically how many people they're serving through their system. I think a deeper question is, for those in the community who are more reliant on public transportation, are they actually accessing it? Whereas, the commuters who use light rail have the option of taking their car into work if they're running late or have to do a series of errands after work. They may make that choice. But as a social worker by discipline, I'm always wondering, what is causing people to isolate and not get out into the community? And so the question I would have for transit providers is, of the people in your community who don't have bikes or segways or use an app to use one of those ride-sharing devices, are they actually using their service? So to what extent that people self-identify as like, I can take a bus or paratransit, am I using those things? In my case, I use the bus, I don't use paratransit. So that's a measure that I would be interested in. And in follow-up to what Kevin was saying about like to what degree is there calorie burn in providing services, I'm thinking about to what degree we can offer elasticity within what is fixed routing. So for instance, there used to be a program, and I don't know if it still exists, during the evening time after dark, that passengers could request a drop-off at a location, not at a stop, if it was closer to where they needed to go. So could we offer that more consistently during the day to meet some of the needs of the passengers?
Thank you. So I added reliability and system elasticity to express some of that into the common theme. Is that fair? Yeah. All right, we're gonna have two more comments. And then we do have to move on. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, mine's not even a full comment, so maybe it makes up for it, which is just that I've got some slides that I'll be showing in a little bit after our break and after Sally speaks, right? Yeah. And I'll be trying to put forward sort of a theory and practice of a comprehensive answer to a lot, maybe not all, but a lot of the concerns that people have raised, especially around a sort of generalized access to destinations. So we'll be moving on from this topic right now, but we'll be coming back to it.
That's my hope. Oh, Kevin, yeah.
Thank you for turning my thing, the thing I threw at the wall, my spitballing, into a phrase, reliability. That was really great. And I just want to add one additional nuance to it, as I'm thinking about this as reliability at the sort of at the per trip level for the rider, but also at a total other time horizon of like, will this type of service even be viable, up as budgets go up and down, as the economy goes up and down, and that's over a span of years, perhaps even decades. I mean, that's hard, and that's harder to measure, of course, but I want to have that reliability also as like a measure. And the perfect example of this is like once somebody plows an 8-lane highway through a neighborhood, like that space is allocated until you take, extreme action to reclaim that land, right? And then whereas like, the bus service, we don't have it, so the bus line disappears, right? So that's it. Thank you.
So short range and long range in the reliabilities or the institutional time horizons.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
So,
I'll add that.
So as you're doing that, I'm just asking Carol or anybody else in the room who can answer. As a guy who's tried to do some of the analysis of are we serving the people who really need us, we can't figure out who they are and where they are. We don't actually have a good idea of where people in wheelchairs live. And if we don't know where people in wheelchairs live, how can we figure out who we're missing? We know who we're serving, we don't know who we're missing. The same thing is true with people who have vision disabilities. You can look at census data and say this is where low income is versus not, and this is how many low income cards seem to live in this particular area because that's where they start their trip making during a day. We can do that kind of analysis, but that doesn't tell us that there are 85 people who live in the next census block group over, but we don't know about them because none of them have ridden it. So if you have data sources that tell us where we should be doing those services, we could actually do that analysis, but we don't know what we don't know, which is the hard part.
I would overlay that with housing.
Or lack thereof,
But specifically, accessibility of housing. Thank you. Accessibility of housing, I think, is what I'm getting at. So
Is there a measure of where accessible housing is?
Well, I think you have to look at a social historical perspective of that. And I'll give you an example. So, not everybody has been integrated into the community over time. The legacy of disability includes institutionalization. And in the greater Seattle area, Faircrest in Shoreline was a residential center for people with severe disabilities. And so I have anecdotally, which we know is maybe bad data, there are a lot of people with wheelchairs that live in Shoreline and North Seattle because that's the area that they knew. Yes, it is kind of harder to echolocate people with disabilities because they are not co-located in the same way. But you can also look at the types of housing that are in different areas. Like, I am not going to buy a townhouse. That's just not where I'm going to live. You can look at what the infrastructure is of different structures. So areas with lots of walk-ups for apartments are also not going to attract people who are of limited mobility. So is that perfect? No, but it might be a starting point to kind of overlay what sorts of housing infrastructure is available and where are things located? Where do people go? So obviously I live in North Seattle because that's where I know. I went to the University of Washington, got established here, made sense for me to stick around because it was what I know. So that's how like a lot of life management happens for folks, is like I figure out a way that works and I'm going to reinforce that rather than mess with something that I know I can count on. That's reliable for me. So looking at things like housing, access to other things like grocery, like I'm not gonna puddle jump my errands on a bus because it totally sucks to do that. I might lose 20 minutes between each location that I need to go. So if I can live close to the things that I use most often and then supplement it with transportation, that works better. So I don't know if that really helped you, Mark, but I think you sometimes have to get out of just looking at transportation by itself and look at, how are people using it? And so if you're more reliant on transportation, you're not going to use it as just like a way to get into work.
She and I are going to talk afterwards, so go ahead.
Sure. Okay. I think this does bring up a whole other question, which is interdependence, right? Like we kept assuming in our conversation that the writer is a single entity that is using the system as a single writer. But we know, especially in the scenario of disability, that there's a network at play, right? There's a support network often that relies on the cost of living being commensurate, like available to be a service, a person who's caregiving for another person with a disability, that the transportation network is able to support that there's parking on my street that will enable people to come and go, like all these things are sort of tied in, and we stayed away from that, I think, for lack of time, but I think it does open a bigger question.